Throughout the Cold War, Soviet tank designers wrestled with one question: how do you protect a tank? They added thicker armor. They developed reactive armor, smoke launchers, laser warning systems, active protection. They tried everything. But they failed to account for one thing. What if the enemy can see you, but you cannot see them? The AH-64 Apache was the answer to that question. Its thermal imaging system, called TADS, could detect targets regardless of day or night. The heat from a tank engine appeared as a bright signature on the screen. Hiding in darkness was impossible. The Hellfire missile could be fired from 8 kilometers away. The tank crew could not see the missile. They could not hear it. They would only feel death. The Soviets spent decades trying to protect tanks. The Americans solved the problem differently. They killed the tank without ever being seen. This is the story of how one helicopter destroyed 50 years of Soviet armored doctrine, and how the crews of 4,000 tanks never saw what killed them. To understand what the Apache destroyed, you must first understand what the Soviets had built. After World War II, the Soviet Union became obsessed with tanks. The Great Patriotic War had been won by armored formations. The T-34 had crushed the Wehrmacht. Soviet military doctrine concluded that the next war would be won the same way. For 4 decades, Soviet factories produced tanks by the tens of thousands. The T-54 and T-55 became the most produced tanks in history. Over 100,000 were built. They were exported to every Soviet ally and client state on Earth. The T-62 followed, with a larger gun and improved armor. Then the T-72, which became the backbone of Soviet armored forces. Fast, relatively cheap, and produced in enormous numbers. Soviet doctrine was built on overwhelming force. In any war with NATO, Soviet tank armies would pour through the Fulda Gap in Germany. Thousands of tanks, advancing in waves. The sheer mass of armor would overwhelm Western defenses. NATO planners were terrified. They calculated that Soviet forces outnumbered Western tanks by 3-1. Some estimates were even worse: 5-1, 7-1. The mathematics seemed impossible. Western armies could not build enough tanks to match Soviet production. They could not train enough crews. They could not afford the cost. They needed a different solution, a way to kill tanks faster than the Soviets could build them. The answer was the attack helicopter. The concept of using helicopters to hunt tanks emerged in the 1960s. The Vietnam War had demonstrated that helicopters were devastating against infantry. What if they could be equally effective against armor? The first dedicated anti-tank helicopter was the AH-1 Cobra. It proved the concept was viable. But the Cobra had limitations. Its targeting systems were primitive. Its weapons were limited in range. It was vulnerable to ground fire. The Army wanted something better. In 1972, they launched a program to develop the Advanced Attack Helicopter. The requirements were ambitious. The new helicopter needed to operate in any weather, day or night. It needed to engage targets from beyond the range of enemy air defenses. It needed to survive hits from heavy machine guns. Hughes Helicopters won the contract. Their design would become the AH-64 Apache. The Apache that emerged was unlike any helicopter that had come before. It was not just an aircraft with weapons attached. It was an integrated weapons system built from the ground up to find and destroy armored vehicles. The key was the Target Acquisition and Designation System, known as TADS. This was a sophisticated sensor package mounted in the nose of the aircraft. It combined a television camera, a laser rangefinder and designator, and most importantly, a forward-looking infrared sensor. The infrared sensor was revolutionary. It detected heat, not light. A tank engine running at operating temperature was essentially a beacon. Even at night, even in fog, even in smoke, the Apache could see its targets clearly. The pilot and gunner wore helmet-mounted displays. Wherever they looked, the sensors followed. They could acquire targets simply by turning their heads. The integration between human and machine was seamless. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. The Apache's eyes would have been useless without an equally revolutionary weapon. That weapon was the AGM-114 Hellfire. Hellfire stood for Helicopter-Launched Fire and Forget Missile. The name described its most important capability. Once launched, the missile guided itself to the target. The helicopter could fire and immediately begin engaging the next target. The missile used a semi-active laser guidance system. The Apache would illuminate the target with its laser designator. The Hellfire would home in on the reflected laser energy. The system was accurate enough to hit a specific point on the tank, usually the thin armor on top of the turret. But the most important feature was range. The Hellfire could be launched from 8 kilometers away. At that distance, the Apache was invisible to the tank crew. They could not see the helicopter. They could not hear its rotors. The first indication of attack would be the explosion. Compare this to the weapons available to tank crews. The main gun of a T-72 was effective to perhaps 3 kilometers against a moving helicopter. The coaxial machine gun might reach 1,500 meters. The crew-served anti-aircraft machine gun had even less range. The mathematics were devastating. The Apache could engage from 5 kilometers beyond the effective range of tank weapons. It could fire 16 Hellfire missiles before needing to rearm. A single Apache could theoretically destroy 16 tanks without ever entering their engagement envelope. And the Apache did not hunt alone. They operated in teams. 4 helicopters working together could engage 64 targets in a single sortie. Against a Soviet tank battalion of 31 tanks, the outcome was predetermined. Soviet doctrine had no answer for this. The Apache's advantages multiplied in darkness. Soviet tanks were designed for a different era of warfare. Their night vision capabilities were primitive. Most relied on active infrared searchlights, which were essentially flashlights that broadcast the tank's position to anyone with the right sensors. The T-72's night fighting capability was particularly limited. The gunner had a simple infrared sight with a range of perhaps 800 meters. The commander had almost no night vision at all. In darkness, the tank was nearly blind. The Apache, by contrast, came alive at night. The thermal imaging system performed better in cool night air than during the heat of day. Tank engines stood out like candles in a dark room. Vehicles that had been running recently left thermal signatures that persisted for hours. The helicopter could approach from any direction. It could hover behind terrain features, exposing only its sensor mast above the ridgeline. The crew could observe and designate targets in complete safety. When they chose to attack, they could pop up, fire, and disappear in seconds. Tank crews reported a terrifying experience. They would see a flash on the horizon. A moment later, a tank would explode. Then another. Then another. The shells seemed to come from nowhere. There was nothing to shoot at, nothing to see. Just death falling from an empty sky. The psychological effect was profound. Iraqi tank crews, many of them veterans of the brutal Iran-Iraq War, simply abandoned their vehicles. They had fought human enemies before. They did not know how to fight ghosts. January 17, 1991. The first shots of Operation Desert Storm. The mission was Task Force Normandy. 8 Apache helicopters and 4 AH-64 Apache Special Operations helicopters. Their objective was to destroy 2 Iraqi early warning radar sites that covered the western approach to Baghdad. The radars had to be eliminated simultaneously. If one site survived long enough to transmit an alert, Iraqi air defenses would be activated. The entire air campaign could be compromised. The Apaches launched from a forward staging area just after midnight. They flew at extremely low altitude, using terrain to mask their approach. The Pave-Lows provided navigation, their sophisticated systems guiding the formation through the featureless desert. At 0238, the helicopters reached their attack positions. The Apache crews could see the radar sites clearly on their thermal displays. The Iraqi operators had no idea they were being watched. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. Hellfire missiles destroyed the radar vans and command buildings. Hydra rockets saturated the positions. 30-millimeter cannon fire swept the sites. Both radar stations were completely destroyed. Not a single Iraqi warning was transmitted. The path to Baghdad was open. More importantly, a message had been sent. The Apache worked. Everything the army had promised, everything the engineers had designed, everything the crews had trained for, it all worked exactly as planned. The tank killing was about to begin. When the ground offensive began on February 24th, the Apaches were ready. The plan called for a massive flanking maneuver. While Iraqi forces expected an assault from Kuwait, the main American attack would come from the west. Armored divisions would sweep around the Iraqi defenses and strike into the Republican Guard positions from an unexpected direction. The Apaches would lead the way. Operating ahead of the advancing armor, Apache battalions conducted what the Army called deep attack missions. They would fly 50, 60, sometimes 100 kilometers beyond the front lines. Their targets were Iraqi reserve forces, supply convoys, and command posts. The results were devastating. On the night of February 26th, Apache helicopters from the 11th Aviation Brigade engaged the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard. This was one of Iraq's elite units, equipped with the best Soviet equipment available: T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, ZSU-23 anti-aircraft guns. In a series of engagements lasting several hours, the Apaches destroyed over 50 armored vehicles. Iraqi tank crews fired blindly into the darkness. Some abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot. Others died without ever identifying what was killing them. The pattern repeated across the battlefield. Apache teams would locate Iraqi formations using their thermal sensors. They would methodically engage targets from standoff range. By the time Iraqi crews understood they were under attack, they were already dying. The 100-hour ground war was a slaughter. Iraq lost nearly 4,000 tanks. The exact number, destroyed by Apaches, is difficult to determine, but estimates suggest they accounted for hundreds of kills. The Gulf War exposed a shocking truth about Soviet military technology. For decades, Western intelligence had assumed that Soviet equipment was roughly comparable to Western systems. Different philosophies, perhaps, different priorities, but fundamentally competitive. The assumption was wrong. Iraqi forces were equipped with the best the Soviet Union had exported. T-72 tanks were the frontline equipment of Soviet armored divisions. The BMP was the standard Soviet infantry fighting vehicle. The ZSU-23-4 was considered one of the best mobile anti-aircraft systems in the world. All of them proved nearly useless against American attack helicopters. The T-72's fire control system could not engage helicopters effectively. Its thermal sight was too primitive to detect an Apache at standoff range. Its main gun elevation was insufficient to engage aircraft hovering above the battlefield. The ZSU-23-4 was designed to engage low-flying aircraft with its radar-directed cannons. But its radar could not detect a helicopter hovering behind terrain. Its guns could not reach targets at 8 kilometers. Against the Apache, it was helpless. Soviet advisors who reviewed the battlefield were stunned. Equipment they had believed was world-class had been destroyed with contemptuous ease. The technological gap was not years, it was generations. The implications for the Soviet military were shattering. If American helicopters could destroy T-72s this easily, what would happen in a war in Europe? Soviet tank armies, the foundation of their entire military strategy, were vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. The Gulf War forced militaries around the world to reconsider their assumptions. Soviet tank doctrine was built on mass: overwhelm the enemy with numbers, accept losses and keep advancing. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could produce more tanks. The Apache changed that mathematics completely. A single Apache battalion of 18 helicopters could carry over 200 Hellfire missiles. In a single night, operating in favorable conditions, they could theoretically destroy an entire tank regiment. And they could do it from distances where Soviet weapons could not reply. This was not a marginal advantage. This was a fundamental asymmetry. The entire concept of massed armored warfare was called into question. Russian military planners who studied the Gulf War drew sobering conclusions. Their armored forces, the pride of Soviet military power, were obsolete. Not outmatched, obsolete. The Apache had made tank-centric doctrine unworkable. The response came slowly. Russia developed new anti-aircraft systems specifically designed to counter-attack helicopters. They improved their own helicopter forces. They added thermal sights to their tanks. But they never caught up. The American advantage in sensor technology, in fire control systems, integrated warfare, continued to grow. The gap revealed in 1991 was never closed. The Gulf War was supposed to feature the largest tank battle since World War II. Iraqi forces had thousands of tanks. American armored divisions were equipped with the M1 Abrams, the most advanced tank in the world. The great tank duels never materialized. Oh, there were tank engagements. The Battle of 73 Easting, the Battle of Medina Ridge. American M1 tanks destroyed hundreds of Iraqi T-72s in these clashes. The technological superiority of the Abrams was overwhelming. But the tanks were almost an afterthought. By the time American armor engaged Iraqi positions, the Apaches had already savaged the enemy formations. Command vehicles had been destroyed. Supply convoys had been annihilated. Crews had abandoned their tanks and fled. The M1 crews found themselves attacking an enemy that was already broken. The great armored battles were cleanup operations, not decisive engagements. This was perhaps the Apache's greatest achievement. It made the tank battle irrelevant. The war was decided before the tanks ever met. The AH-64 Apache remains in service today, more than 4 decades after its introduction. It has been continuously upgraded with better sensors, better weapons, and better survivability. The longbow variant added a millimeter-wave radar mounted above the rotor. This allowed the Apache to detect and classify targets while remaining completely hidden behind terrain. The helicopter could rise for just seconds, scan the battlefield, and then drop back down to plan its attack. The latest versions incorporate data links that allow Apaches to share targeting information with other aircraft, ground forces, and command centers. The helicopter has become a node in a networked battlefield, feeding intelligence as well as delivering firepower. But the fundamental concept remains unchanged. Find the enemy before he finds you. Kill him from beyond his range. Never give him a fair fight. The Apache killed more than tanks in the Gulf War. It killed an idea. The idea that massed armored formations could dominate the modern battlefield. The idea that numbers could overcome technology. The idea that Soviet military doctrine would work against a sophisticated enemy. Every military in the world studied the Gulf War. Every military drew the same conclusion. The age of the tank had not ended. But the age when tanks alone could decide battles was over. The Apache proved that the future belonged to whoever could see the battlefield most clearly. And in the darkness of the Iraqi desert, only one side could see it all.